So it's pretty special, for me at least, to be able to have Vinod join us here for the first one. Largely because he played he was just such an influential sounding board to me as I was working through kind of this whole move back to Salt Lake. And he's provided a lot of really fantastic guidance over the time we've gotten to know each other. And so it's a real treat for me to be able to have you here with us tonight to kind of kick this off. I got to know Vinod probably, a year and a half ago? Yeah. So we were introduced while under the auspices of him looking at a portfolio company of ours called Bitly. And ultimately, he's now an investor in Bitly, which we're grateful for his support. But it was a fascinating first meeting, and it was one that I think about often. And that was, it was really set up as like a half an hour. I was going in to try to sell him on Bitly, and why it was such a great investment, and why he would be such a perfect fit for it. But ultimately, it turned into probably a 2-hour, 3-hour. Like it was one of these, just kind of mind melds that was really influential on me as an individual. And when I think back on when I was thinking about what kind of event I would want to have here in Salt Lake, a lot of that was around even though I built most of my career here in the city, so much of what's helped me to kind of grow into the entrepreneur and the founder and the investor that I'm trying to become has been these networks that have been formed outside of the state, and these amazing people that I've been able to interact with who've really elevated my thinking, who've taken me under their wing, who've shared their ideas and mentored me along the way. And so, I think it's easy for us here to get caught in this kind of local rut. But one of the reasons we felt strongly about being able to move back here is that we really believe strongly that we're moving into a networked economy, and that our location here in Salt Lake is not. It isn't the limiting factor that maybe it had been in prior generations. And so, in bringing Vinod here tonight, I'm hoping that we can have a spirited discussion, as we usually do, and that we can have kind of a recreate maybe a little bit of that conversation we started, and then see if we can push it a little further here in the context of Salt Lake. So I don't know how much of an intro Vinod actually needs. I mean, he's one of the most well-known VCs. Venture, what is it?
Venture assistant.
Venture assistant. I don't want to call him a VC. He does not like to be called a VC. So he's one of the most successful and best-known venture investors and mentor and advocate for startups. And I think one of the really great thinkers who is not afraid to not only speak his mind, but also really kind of be provocative in pushing people to think bigger, to do more, and as a family man here, and as part of our culture here in Salt Lake, for sure, someone who's done that all with a family of 4 children and 2 dogs that are the size of children. And so, I think he brings a really interesting perspective that I think can be valuable for all of us here. So, with that, let's welcome Vinod Khosla. So I've got some questions here, some that I've kind of.
So Bryce, it'd be good to start by just asking, how many people here are interested in entrepreneurship? And how many are actually entrepreneurs? And how many technology entrepreneurs? Okay, gives us a good feel for the audience.
Good context for what we've got going on here? Okay, so I've got some questions put together, but I also we've got a little, is it up there yet? We've got VK sessions here. So what I'm hoping you guys can use on, with hashtags on Twitter is if you have questions, we don't have an open mic, mainly because I know there's that guy, and he's probably in the audience somewhere, who always runs to the mic first. And so we are going to cut you off at the knees. Feel free to tweet out your heart's delight, whatever questions you've got, but we aren't turning the mic over to you tonight. So that's our hashtag. We've got a search running here, so if you've got some questions you want to ask, fire away on Twitter, and we'll make sure to try to cover those that make sense. So my first question, especially given the audience we've got here, is why don't you like Utah companies? I mean, I looked at your website. There's not a single Utah company on the whole thing. I can't imagine you haven't seen tons of Utah companies.
Well, we've seen a few.
Okay.
And admittedly, we are biased by being in a particular area because we have such a flood of local companies that one gets swamped.
Mm-hmm.
But there's probably a larger factor. One of the things I look for a lot is, and there's a paper on my website on this called Gene Pool Engineering, a Startup. I like a mix of backgrounds.
Mm-hmm.
And, people talk a lot about diversity, but in a startup, diverse backgrounds just result in more interesting experiments.
You're talking about the overall gene pool of a startup. So lots of people coming with different perspectives.
Yeah.
Okay.
What I've tended to see in Utah are an entrepreneur who's sort of fixed on something, wants to do that, probably is well qualified to do that, but is not somebody who's built around them, the team or the gene pool, to push them further and harder and in more diverse directions.
Mm-hmm.
That's sort of one problem we see in Valley companies tend to be fairly diverse.
So just because it's such a magnet for people from all over the world, whether it's Stanford or the schools there?
Yeah, it's schools. It's also very, if you look at Silicon Valley, it really doesn't have a culture because it's so diverse. In fact, if there's a culture, it's a mix of cultures.
Right.
And I think that's a big advantage for the Valley. We tend not to fall into norms.
Mm-hmm.
So that's one issue. I'll give you an example of an area that was very, very successful in venture in the 1980s,
mm-hmm.
Back around Route 128 in Boston. But because they had no diversity, they all were trying to build computer systems like Digital and Prime and Wang, and they never were able to evolve as a community into new things as they happened. One of the most surprising things about Silicon Valley is anytime a new area pops up, Silicon Valley seems to have enough talent that they can jump in. So take healthcare today. Now, one of my favorite new areas is consumer-driven healthcare. I've written a blog why we don't need 80% of what doctors do.
We're going to get into that later because there's
Yeah.
a lot of people you don't like. I want to talk about these people you want to put out of business.
I'm just trying to solve the healthcare problem. If you don't
You just
need
want-
80% of what doctors do, you
just
don't
want
need
a
80%.
doctor to be an iPhone app. That's it.
Yeah, it's
Okay.
good. A lot more
Okay.
people have access to
Okay.
it.
All right. We'll
But
put a
take
pin in
somebody
that
like
later.
that, right? You can accumulate the rest of the talent very quickly from so many different backgrounds. That needs some hardware guys, some signal processing guys, some data analytics and predictive analytics guys, some cardiologists. That comes together much easier. Route 128 didn't have it. And I think it's the principle.
Do they not have it, or do they not have a way to collect it? Because it seems like that's a relatively diverse. I mean, you've got Stanford, you've got MIT, you've got Harvard right there. You've got a bunch of world-class institutions.
Yeah.
So
They,
why
they
doesn't it
do,
gel there
and
the same way?
I'm actually a little surprised that more of this evolution. So if you think of this community, startup community as an organism, if it's diverse, it will evolve better. Otherwise, it'll do well efficiently in one direction. When that direction dies, dies off. Maybe I'm being too esoteric. In my model, MIT should have provided that, but it didn't. And I'm guessing it has something else that also may be an issue in Utah, which is too much conventionalism.
Okay.
So venture capital on the East Coast evolved as an offshoot of Wall Street. It became a financial thing. And I suspect...
But what is that? So let's drill down on that a little bit more then. Why is that DNA different than, say, what's going on the West Coast?
Well, one, you can build mathematical models and prove that diverse organisms or diverse communities in evolutionary system do substantially better than monoculture organisms. And that's why environmentalists, and this has nothing to do with the environment, but it's say in biology, if you want a healthy agricultural system, it should be polyculture, not monoculture. If it's all corn crops, then you're likely to get more pests, more disease, more costs, more everything, and less evolution. I think it's true of startups too.
Okay.
In that sense, traditional societies hurt evolution.
Sorry, I lost my connection on my iPad, so I'm going to have to pull up our hashtag.
So I think it's a problem that can be overcome. But if I were a startup entrepreneur, I'd work twice as hard to make sure that diversity was engineered into my team. And that's why I've written a whole paper. It's like 30 pages long. It's could have been a book.
I know a guy who makes books. Maybe we can get you plugged into O'Reilly.
Bezos has made it easy to do singles now,
Yes,
as he keeps
exactly.
telling me.
Exactly.
I think it's important to have that diversity. So that's important. I would say the other thing that's missing in Salt Lake City is really successful role models.
Okay.
You know, I fell in love with the idea of starting a company when I was 16. I was growing up in Indian military family, so I never knew anybody in business. I never knew anybody in science or technology, but I loved science and technology as a kid. But I read about Intel starting up. Hungarian immigrant, Andy Grove, a couple of other people were able to start a company. And it immediately became a role model for me. I said, if they can do that, if a Hungarian immigrant can start a company like Intel, why can't I? Even though I didn't know what business meant, because I didn't know anybody in business. And my dad wanted me to go join the Indian Army.
16, 17 at this time.
Probably 15 or 16.
Okay.
And I fell in love with the idea. And I only show this story. I can go into a lot more detail. But
And that first company, though, was not a technology company.
The first thing I tried to start was, one of the things I had to do as a kid was go get milk every day because milk spoiled. So I had to go while the cow was being milked. And it sort of became a bugaboo for me. I was wasting a lot of time waiting around for milking the cow. And so I figured best thing to do was make a milk that didn't need refrigeration. And so I started thinking at the age of, probably by the time I was 18 or so, about starting a company that did soy milk, that it didn't need to be refrigerated. But that didn't work out.
No, but it's an interesting story.
The point I want to carry here is local role models will help.
So that's the point I wanted to make, was that the local role, like the local paradigm you had at the time, actually wasn't a very big, very interesting paradigm, right? The kind of surroundings you had, your context was cows and milking, and but by coming to the States, you ultimately ended up coming and doing some undergrad or some graduate work here.
Yeah.
And how did that? So taking that context, because you did your undergrad in India, and you launched. Were you doing the company at the same time you were in school?
I wanted to start the company when I graduated, but they told me it would be 7 years to get a phone line. So
7 years to get a
7
phone
years
line.
to get a phone line
Right.
in India in 1976. I said, I'm heading to Silicon Valley.
But you didn't go to Silicon Valley.
Well, I went to Carnegie Mellon only because they paid for my education and got me to this country. There was no other way.
But Silicon Valley was the target. When you came?
Yeah,
Okay.
absolutely. When I came to this country, Silicon Valley was the target. I went to Carnegie Mellon because they paid for it. Then I applied to Stanford for business school. They didn't let me in the first year, turned me down. So I applied again the second year. They turned me down the second year, and then I had an argument with them. So long story short, but they let me.
I actually don't want to cut that story short, because that's actually one of my favorite VK stories. So how did you get into Stanford? I mean, I just think this is very indicative of who you are.
So before I get to the story, let me give you two things about entrepreneurs that are really important. The odds never matter. And the resources you have, you think are not enough, but they don't really matter. So when I was in India, as soon as I started dreaming of starting a company, the only thing I thought about was what was the next step to starting my company. And there's an important paper on our website that a professor, business school professor at INSEAD wrote called Effectual Reasoning, which is what entrepreneurs do. They have a long vision, but they don't sort of try and connect where they are to the total vision. When you start Twitter, you don't think you're going to take over the world. You sort of say, what can I do next with whatever limited resources I got? And does it get me a little closer towards that point, even if I'm zigzagging left or right? And that's an important part of entrepreneurship. You take whatever you have and you try and push it and go the next step and always create new options for yourself. So what I did at Stanford was, first year I applied, they said, you have no work experience, we like 2 years of work experience. I said, great. I got 2 full-time jobs in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, and I applied again the next year.
Right, that's
and that was 2 full years of work.
Totally.
And they turned me down again. They thought it was funny. I was pretty serious.
You usually are.
So I did tell them they didn't have a choice, and I started arguing with the director of admissions. And I'd call him enough and harassed him enough, and entrepreneurs tend to be pretty close to the line of stalking. He could have accused me of stalking. He eventually said, okay, I'll put you on the wait list, which was all I needed. It was progress towards my goal of getting to Silicon Valley and my intermediate goal of getting to Stanford to be around Silicon Valley. And then I kept calling him every week from March or April, and he kept turning me down, said there was no room. This is not well known, I had applied to Carnegie Mellon too and gotten to the business school.
Oh, interesting.
And they started on Labor Day, and I actually enrolled in the program. So I was worse off, and I didn't even have fees to pay if Stanford let me in, because I already paid my fees. But I kept harassing Stanford. And I was 3 weeks into the program at Carnegie Mellon, into the MBA program.
You actually started the program?
Yeah, I was 3 weeks into the program, and I called, and by now I knew everybody in the admissions office, and I'd say 9 out of 10 people in the admissions office were my friends, and they were giving me all the inside scoop on, I knew about every candidate that was on the bubble.
So not just your own prospects, but everybody who was on the bubble.
Yeah. You know, entrepreneurs really do a lot of digging. And they basically, one of them told me that somebody might be dropping out. So I called the admissions director 3 weeks into my program at Carnegie, the week before classes started at Stanford, because they start late in September, and I said, I'm coming. And we hemmed and hawed. We talked about 3 or 4 times, and finally, trying to cut it short, Thursday he said, okay, you can come. I showed up at Stanford on Friday. We started classes the next Tuesday.
That is an entrepreneur.
And people in the admissions office put me up on their couches.
Like sleeping on their couches?
I didn't have a place to rent. I'd already paid my deposit in Pittsburgh, and I didn't have fees to pay.
Right.
But I made it through.
Right. That's amazing. I just love that story.
But you know, entrepreneurship is a lot of ups and downs. And so those of you who tried it, there's a presentation I first wrote in 1986. The title's still the same, and about half the slides are still from 1986. It's called The Entrepreneurial Roller Coaster, where the highs are high and the lows are low. Mm-hmm. And they really are low. It can be pretty damn depressing.
So that was actually one of the... Well, that was actually one of the questions that we batted around in email, and that was...
But before we go there, I want to finish the thought we had about Utah, because I think there's probably too many forces trying to get you to be conventional. And the reason I believe Route 128 failed was they became unidimensional around computers. And then they had all these New York financial types, Wall Street types, trying to do investing, which really doesn't go well with entrepreneurship. You can't calculate IRRs when you're trying to do an entrepreneurial company. You sort of can do the right things and hope the right things happen.
In conventional wisdom.
Right? And I think that combination of the wrong investors and sort of a less diverse ecosystem hurt Boston a lot. Mm-hmm. In a place like this, you see the same thing, and I see it a lot in London too.
Interesting.
They have financial investors, and they force them into mechanisms that ensure companies try and do financial metrics instead of exploring options. And entrepreneurship is about exploring options and figuring it out. It's not you have the plan in your head. You have some pretty strong belief systems about value you want to bring, but how it happens, I like to say be obstinate about your vision, but not about your tactics. You change tactics all the time. We were talking about Twitter earlier. Jack Dorsey's on the, started Twitter, and I'm on his board at Square. Yeah. You know, it started with a little dongle, but Jack's goal is not to do payments or a dongle, is to reinvent money and reinvent the shopping.
And was that always the case, or has it grown from there?
I think he had a large vision, but it is definitely come into focus over time. But I would say he did face a problem. It's a problem all successful entrepreneurs face. I'll come back to your original question. He'd done Twitter, so the next thing he had to do had to be bigger. Right? That's a problem successful entrepreneurs had. After Sun, I had a hard time building a $50 million company. Yeah? It just, you didn't want to work on something less challenging, and so Jack had a large vision. But I don't think he'd say he knew exactly how it would play out. Right. But he knew he wanted to reinvent the way money was handled and transacted. Right. But sorry,
No, it's okay.
I think back to this diversity is really important.
Well, I think it's interesting.
And I do want to come back later to talk about why tradition forces you into conservatism. That is the opposite of what you need. You need risk-taking and friendliness to failure.
Let's keep pulling on that thread, because the reality is when you go read books about startup communities or you hear talks about startup communities, there's generally a checklist of items that they suggest you need to have, right? You need to have these types of wonderful events where we can get together and talk about these things. Or that you need venture capital as something. You know, that tends to be something a lot of people hang their hat on, and as a result they say, oh man, our startup communities aren't taking off because there's no investors here. Nobody wants to invest here. There's no angels. There's no nothing. You're saying something quite different than that.
Yeah, I'm saying something quite different. There isn't a program to get venture entrepreneurship into a region that I've ever seen succeed. What I fundamentally believe you need diversity, and you need encouragement of experimentation and failure. I like to say my willingness to fail is what gives me the ability to succeed. And unless I was willing to fail, I'd be so conservative, I'd be assured of only minor successes. And minor successes don't create the role models I talked about earlier.
Yeah.
So you need sort of this, earlier this evening at the U, I talked about this need for being unreasonable. And think about the following. If you do reasonable things, you'll do the same thing other people are doing, and you won't create anything interesting. Right? So you'll do the next incremental thing, and you'll have an incremental company, and nice. It may be a good job. If you don't want to work for somebody else, that serves a purpose. Mm-hmm. And there's nothing wrong with that. But to create role models like Google and Facebook and Twitter and Sun and Apple, you need to do unreasonable things to make a global mark, make stories that even the Wall Street Journal and New York Times and the Guardian want to write about. That takes stepping out of the realm of what almost everybody is comfortable with. Mm-hmm. And in the community, if it tries to get you to be reasonable and conservative, plays counter to what it really needs to break out. I think that's a problem in most communities, especially
so
traditional.
Not specific to Utah. You're saying you've
No.
seen that in a lot of different places.
Yeah, they're used to doing things a certain way, and they want to extend that. Mm-hmm. And they don't want to fail. Most people are embarrassed of failure, and that's a problem. Let me just say the opposite. I always say, I don't mind failing, but if we succeed, it better be worth succeeding. Right. Think about that. If you're a traditional investor, you focus on reducing risk, but usually what happens is you reduce risk by building a safer and safer plan to the point where the consequences of success are inconsequential. It's self-fulfilling. Mm-hmm. And so, yeah, you can build a company, but it's of no consequence, at least in any kind of national or global sense. And traditional communities force people into it, and so if I'm an entrepreneur, you have to break away from that. Mm-hmm. Look, when I grew up, my dad thought it'd be great if I joined the Indian Army at the age of 16. Mm-hmm. He didn't even want me to go to college. You join the Indian Army, it's a great job for life, and, it's great. So breaking out of that and having a small cadre of people, a community like this, like Start SLC, is really important to provide that moral support when you doubt yourself. Mm-hmm. Look, there isn't an entrepreneur who hasn't gone through a lot of doubt, who hasn't been scared shitless at times, excuse the words. And I'd like to say, there is no courage if you're not scared. Right. And so if you're doing something that's not scary, it's conventional, it's traditional, everybody says, yeah, that's reasonable, you are outside the bound of what we are calling breakthrough ideas and world-changing ideas and things that matter and things that stand out. Right. And in some ways, communities graduate one other, and if Start SLC had a goal, it'd be to create the support system so people who are in this fringe, and it is a fringe, can get the support and the courage through that scared moment when they don't give up.
Or they just move to the Bay Area.
Or they just move to the Bay Area.
What would you advise?
Um,
Okay, let me ask you this question. If Fusion.io had moved to the Bay Area, do you think it would be a different company? Or
I'm almost certain Fusion.io in the Bay Area would have been a very different company.
okay, let's go there.
So earlier today, as I was thinking about this evening, I was saying, what's a successful company, Fusion.io? Would I invest in it? Would I have invested in it? If I'd seen it when it was starting up. And I don't know it too well, and I believe NEA invested when it was going and successful, and that worked out fairly well. But when I looked at it, I said, I would have been thinking, will this team expand? Is it diverse enough? Does it have 4 computer science PhDs, one from computer systems, one from applications, that's what I mean by diversity, that would push the evolution of this thing. And that hasn't happened to Fusion.io. It's still a SSD box. It's still a generic piece of hardware.
Right.
It hasn't been.
They haven't built.
Okay. Now, they're lucky because competitors should have flattened their margins a long time ago. Probably doesn't take a lot of engineering to replicate that. But they were lucky that people didn't notice how important SSDs were becoming, because most people in computer science were looking at traditional memory and traditional hard disks and didn't find this thing in the middle and didn't pay attention, and Fusion.io suddenly grew up, especially because of all the pressure on computer systems for performance, because of all the internet scale things that were going on. But I don't think Fusion.io did the things to really make sure its second act made it as big as EMC. And it could have been.
And you're saying it didn't because it didn't have the depth, there wasn't the depth of talent here, or
Yeah.
they didn't invest enough resources in trying to attract the
Create
depth of talent.
create that.
Okay.
Now think of the dynamics if the world had, if I'd invested in Fusion.io, I would have asked, how many computer science PhDs did you hire? What are you doing about, there's 2 interesting classes of people who push companies, I find. It's either the people who dropped out in high school or the people who got PhDs.
All of us regular Joes with undergrad degrees.
Both tend to, I love dropouts because they dropped out for a reason because they were so impatient.
Well, plus you want to get rid of teachers anyway, too, so
Yeah.
we'll go back to that.
We'll come back to that. That engineering, that diversity, I know if I'd invested, I would have pushed them. Whether it meant opening an office in the Bay Area, whether pulling those people in here, or, there's plenty of people in Boston who love skiing who would have moved to Utah. Skiing in the East Coast is shitty. Look,
true.
Entrepreneurs find any excuse to get the talent.
Yes.
Don't tell me there aren't 10 really great computer science PhDs who wouldn't love a skiing lifestyle.
So you're saying Salt Lake shouldn't be handicapping itself. You shouldn't be giving themselves artificial
The problem
limitations just
isn't
because
being
they're
able
here.
to recruit those resources. They aren't around you, so you got to recruit.
Right.
But the bigger problem is not pushing to find them, because nobody is urging you to find them. Right? That's the problem I see